Hey everyone, it's been a long time since I've done one of these, but after all, these are Hashi's favorite to write. Today I'd like to talk about goons within the power scaling community, how they play into the overall ecosystem of servers and arguments, and in this video, I hope to depersonalize the argument, i.e. remove this weird inherent bias people have to arguments just because of who's arguing for them. In order to really examine the anatomy of the goon, we must first look at the environment that leads to the emergence of the goon. A common thing in communities is to have a sort of social hierarchy. In your stereotypical high school drama, you'll have your popular jocks, your nerds, your emo kids, and everything in between, sorted into groups like it's some nature documentary. In the power scaling scene, it's no different, except for instead of in-person social circles that are really only enforced by stigmas and harsh words, it's usually servers and roles of some kind. What you will see happen in these servers is that the most prominent person typically owns it. There are some cases where there is a sort of administrator who owns it for the person, but we aren't talking about technical ownership. This is more of an identity. For example, people still call the JJK server Clothespin server after all. And if you don't know about this particular example, typically you'll find any big YouTuber's Discord is owned by them, but not entirely run by them. Below the, let's call them the leader. As I mentioned earlier, you have their lieutenants, who are usually as relevant. This is not to be confused with simple mods who have the same rank, as this is usually a social standing in its tendency with role allocation. Then you have the chaff, which is all the randoms, NPCs, generic Goku avatar folk. As I'll kind of hit in a bit, goons and chaff aren't the same, since anyone can be a goon. There is one more role, which would be the class clown, or the guy in the server no one takes seriously and just kind of mocks. It's an unfortunate fate really, but inevitable. Where these roles come into conflict with integrity is when we see that if the leader is too relevant to the community, they will make an argument, and whether or not this argument is good or bad, the lieutenants will stick by and actually defend it, only because the leader made it, which then turns the innocent chaff into full-blown goons. Now, the unaffiliated randoms will also try to defend the argument sometimes, but they're just randoms. If you ever come across them, just like use your Conkers hockey or something. A thing to note, though, is that being a leader or goon isn't some divine birthright or something. To avoid getting too historical, most modern leaders were lieutenants in other communities that branched off for one reason or another. And you'll notice in current servers, a lot of prominent people will have their own servers with their own lieutenants in that server. And those lieutenants will have their own servers ad infinitum. But what's funny though is that usually lieutenants and leaders are the same group of people as to who's gonna join Goku Gang 2254 server and help him argue. So instead of it just being these servers that just exist within the ecosystem, they just end up being a bunch of semi-isolated circles that become a Venn diagram, that share loads of members from both because they're friends and because there are only ever so many competent people. Another very important thing to note is that the trash has to go somewhere, and in this interconnected ecosystem, even if you ban Ratty Window Licker 69, you'll just end up in other servers, possibly becoming an even more ratty regressive piece of scum. So far, this has just been an observation about how arguments happen within these social circles, and now let's talk about why that's a bad thing. So when we talk about any take in fiction, any interpretation of a work, we are talking about what is the most consistent and evident interpretation. No one really cares about what you can argue because you can argue anything. It's about how consistent it is and ideally how much of the work it explains in the process. Everyone presumably has some kind of standard for how consistent an interpretation has to be. Well, maybe not some randoms that sell me as the type who don't have an internal monologue in their head on some NPC shit. Now, these standards will get compromised because the leader has some argument, narrative, agenda, etc. he wants to push. And so the lieutenants may initially push back, or maybe they won't for some regressive reason, but eventually they will compromise and just argue the new thing. This is bad because now instead of saying this is the most evident consistent interpretation, it's now this is what the leader told me. which also now turns those folk you'd think were not NPCs into NPCs for an argument. So instead of having arguments that are actually founded on consistency and evidence, we have ones that are a popularity contest seeing which army of goons can push the argument, making what should be a meritocracy of ideas into a holy war where arguing against the leader's dogma is heresy. The worst side effect of this isn't even the initial argument. Instead, these people will compromise their standards to defend each other. For example, Bob has a bad Sonic argument, while Tony has a bad Bleach argument. Bob and Tony ignore the flaws in each other's arguments and will defend each other's arguments because neither one of them wants the other to point out the flaws in each other's argument. This may sound oddly organized, and trust me, it's not. It's just what happens. People will subconsciously align their social circles this way, and you will see all sorts of wonky stuff pop out. Now, goons come in many flavors, and it's not just the chaff who are goons for someone's specific bad arguments, but rather anyone will religiously follow anywhere from one bad argument to an archetype of bad arguments. What you'll notice is that all of them would rather talk about some other subject rather than the work in question, sidestepping the argument entirely. Goons come in and aren't limited to math or philosophy, but the core trait is that they hold one type of regressive argument true and use it to evade actually discussing the work at hand. We could sit here for days going over bad arguments people use to avoid discussing Naruto, but I'd rather keep this section brief so as to not unintentionally give communities who aren't vaccinated against such plague-esque arguments to any new sickness. The strategy of argumentation is as if we were playing Call of Duty and arguing about something in-game. But instead of just testing out what we were talking about, say which gun unalives people faster, you argue, well, we should 1v1 in CSGO to see who's right, since it's a better game competitively. Or any other dumb reason only vaguely relating back to the original argument since both games have AKs or any other dumb reason. As if that wasn't dishonest enough, what you will always notice is that they will establish all these weird standards for arguments, but then never go over why their argument fits those standards, because they don't care about making a truthful, consistent argument. They only care about the ever rattier looking quote-unquote W. On the topic of moving arguments into communities, in real war, a very important thing is logistics. Shipping your arms and armor to the front, keeping your troops fed, etc. Arguments should not be the same way. You shouldn't need this support group for your argument. Your argument that Peter Griffin has time hacks shouldn't be reliant on you sending in missionaries to servers bombarding them with the argument till they just stop caring about arguing back. Your argument should work in a vacuum independent of who's presenting the evidence and how many of them there are. This kind of gets into another topic which could be its own video, debate skill. Aside from very basic critical thinking skills, i.e. not just accepting what someone says true basically, I don't think debate skill is a real thing. It's about the argument and evidence at hand, not some nebulous X factor. Infinite speed, inaccessible speed, immeasurable speed, or even irrelevant speed Goku is wrong no matter who argues it, because it's just not true in the series. No amount of you being quote-unquote built different changes it. And certainly no amount of people you have had compromise their standards. While we are on the topic of skill, people will usually bring up that because they are better than their goons, i.e. their goons couldn't defeat the argument so they had to compromise and agree to it, that their goons are the litmus test for people arguing against the dogma. Now, I don't think quote-unquote winning an argument comes down to skill as I detailed earlier. I think it's all about knowledge. Do you have the evidence at hand? Do you know what it says? Etc. It's why if you present an argument to someone who's never read the series, more often than not, you can make any argument seem true by hiding context. Likewise, you can easily convince an army of window lickers that any argument is true. But what goons will do, as an attempt to convince you, that instead of talking about if Naruto is strong or whatever the actual subject is, we have to talk about some unrelated bullshit they can lie about to create a sort of web of lies that they can sit in the middle of and claim victory. people will also have their goons bombard someone to, as they will say, test their debate stamina, as if you were bound to argue with every Goku PFP about the same flowchart cookie cutter argument or web of lies. I will also add that I don't think not wanting to argue makes any position inherently wrong. As for one, not everything is worth talking to everyone about. And if we're talking and I say 2 + 2 = 4, and you try to start a math argument to which I decline, that doesn't then make 2 + 2 not equal 4 in some grand sphere of ideas, nor does it affect any original topic we were talking about. Because 1, arguments have never worked like that, and 2, simply declining a debate, or in this case, a sub-debate, is not the same as the initial premise being proven wrong and all evidence being explained under a different premise. To reiterate, I think forfeiting or declining a debate is not the same as the premise being proven wrong. For example, if we're doing any topic like, say, Naruto vs. Luffy, and I argue my side to the point where there's no counters you can present, only to say that I forfeit, that doesn't then mean that your character magically wins and all my points are instantly wrong. You can say, but I won the debate, but who really cares? It's pretty evident your position was wrong. This same kind of idea will be present in a lot of tournaments, where the central conceit is that you can win or lose, independent of what's true due to the tournament rules, along with some people just giving up for any arbitrary reason. All in all, this is why I think debate skill is a terrible thing that is only magnified by the weird social structures in the community. So far, I've kind of danced around the reasons why it's bad for the community, offhandedly mentioning themes, etc. And while writing videos like this, it's kind of hard to keep the central moral out of the rest of the script to put it in its own dedicated section. The reason these behaviors are bad for the community is because ultimately it degrades our ability to truth seek. Instead of arguments working because they are true, consistent, or insightful, they exist because of weird logistical networks of goons who will spread it until their battery runs out. Arguments no longer exist on their merits, but rather in some sort of weird condition where arguments are like a character in a versus matchup. Like, yeah, my Naruto argument works in this server under these standards with this people around. I know someone's gonna say, but these people are biased, but that doesn't matter, because convincing someone doesn't change if the argument is true or not. If you presented your case and all your opponent can say is, I'm not convinced, you're wasting your time to continue arguing with them. If it's Naruto vs. Luffy, and you can't provide any win cons or defeaters to mine, and all you can say is that you're not convinced, hate to break it to you, but you lost that argument. Your premise has been disproven and you have no counters to mine. Being convinced doesn't change anything. I know someone's gonna bring up judges and convincing them, but the job of a judge is to be the ideally unbiased arbiter of which points went which way, not that they need to individually be convinced of your side. Hell, you can have judges who disagree with you, but because they should be unbiased, that should have no bearing on if your points stand within a debate. Judges, or rather a mediator, even can help with what I call the third person effect. This is when two people are arguing and a third person simply reiterating an argument can get someone to snap out of the debater brain mentality and realize that they are wrong. As typically in a debate, people will just assume they can't be wrong for some reason. None of these factors which people seem to care about, like which server it happens in, who will be there, etc., don't actually come off as being thorough, but rather as a paranoid attempt to edge out a win on some other metric other than just being true. Now before we conclude this video, let's talk about what makes an argument good. To briefly recap to the people who usually need Subway Surfers or Minecraft parkour on the screen to pay attention, a good argument shouldn't need to be argued only in specific spaces or have this support network of people to back it up. It should exist in a vacuum and remain true. On top of that, your argument should obviously be the most consistent within a work, not creating any inconsistencies, and ideally explaining away some supposed inconsistencies. This argument should be well supported within the work, not relying on some Kit Kat wrapper to even be considered a possibility, citing the cultural significance of Kit Kats in Japan to double down. your argument should ideally change the way other people look at the work. Take, for example, the idea of a boom tube amp. This single interpretation has now changed the way people talk about DC characters, and next to everyone has heard of it or seen it. Once your argument fulfills these criteria, we can then discuss further about what predictions your interpretation can make. Like, if your argument is true, then what could happen within the story? Mind you, all of these factors that I have brought up do not rely on some nebulous debate skill or where it's being argued. Just like your math homework, the name at the top doesn't matter. All that matters is the work within and if it's correct or not. While it can be cool to say, yeah, that's my argument, that should be said because your argument is good without the name on it, not because the name makes the argument. And just like with the math example, it could be good sometimes to ask a tutor, or in this case, a prominent member in the community, what they think. But as I pointed out at the beginning, with hiding context, you can give people the right evidence for just about any position. So when it comes to citing that, well, this guy agrees, you should think, well, why do they agree? What evidence was presented? Was it the same evidence I just got done responding to? As I said prior, your arguments shouldn't require a logistical network. So if it didn't work without someone's seal of approval, then it doesn't really deserve to work in general. In addition, there is a big distinction between I agree with this and it's something I believe in, and I can see where your argument is coming from, or I think you have a valid argument there. An inconsistent or incorrect argument is more often than not inconsistent or incorrect due to the interpretation of the source material rather than any glaring logical flaw in the argument. So most people, not just window lickers and randoms, will without context not see any problems with the argument. Well, anyway, that's it for the video. I hope you all enjoyed it, but before I go, let me give you some last minute advice. Don't be someone else's lackey or front-line of defense against criticism. You should be known by your username and ideally this super cool interpretation you pioneered, and not as someone's son who parrots all of their arguments or defending their server like an attack dog.